Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumila Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. In 1994, the legacy of apartheid presented the new South Africa with enormous challenges such as poverty, inequality, and immense aspiration for greater access to basic public services. The government immediately began addressing these challenges by enshrining constitutional rights to service access, radically reforming economic and sector policies, and funding ambitious service delivery programs. This, coupled with a new governance and administrative framework for racially diverse provinces and municipalities, had to be built, and the new structure had to progress quickly in delivering the improved services expected by the people. Today on Rights and Recourse, we examine the road traversed by the Department of Public Service Administration and the Public Service Commission in meeting these objectives. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Advocate Richard Sizani, Chairperson of the Public Service Commission, and Mr. Gareth van Onselen, a consultant for the South African Institute of Race Relations, but sometimes he also moonlights as a journalist. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon, Mr. Matez.
Let's start with you, Gareth. Gareth, recently you penned a critical analysis of what you refer to as political musical chairs turnover in National Executive Administration since 2009. What drove you to develop this opinion?
Right, well, there's been a lot of analysis and political commentary about the turnover in cabinet. The president is overseeing his 12th cabinet at the moment, and the massive turmoil there is obviously unhelpful for stability and certainty. But that focus is almost exclusively political on the executive and the cabinet, and I wanted to see to what degree that same kind of turmoil is evident in the actual administration. And the head of the administration is a director general, the equivalent, or they work together, the minister and the director general, to run a department. And so I went through all the relevant departments to see the turnover rate for director generals, and it was no less uncertain and that just as tumultuous.
What are the most critical issues that you are pointing out to, and what impact would these have on service delivery and the function of the state in terms of institutional memory?
Right. Well, the way in which Director General appointments are managed is a 5-year term, a contract for 5 years, and in an ideal universe, that 5-year term for a Director General should overlap with a 5-year electoral term with a minister, so that the two work together in unison and there's continuity in the department they're overseeing over a 5-year period. If that party wins an election, they can then renew the contract of that DG if they've got a good working relationship, or after the election they can review it and get someone else. If there's massive turnover in both the cabinet and the director general level, then it becomes very hard to maintain policy focus and the right kind of focus on outcomes, because everything constantly has to be renegotiated, re-explained, doubled up. People will have different emphases or different things they want to prioritize, and that might contradict a previous person. And at the end of the day, it makes it very difficult to implement a program of action if the key figures in charge of it are constantly changing.
Advocate Sizani, if the Public Service Commission is mandated to monitor and evaluate the organization and administration of public service, is it afforded this space by the executive?
Well, it is afforded the space to look at all these issues that also Gary raised in his program, in his study, and also it is allowed to make recommendations relating to how you can deal with them. Of course, in some we have been successful, in others we have not been successful.
What becomes the role of the public service when the public service is crippled in this manner, which obviously affects service delivery?
Well, let me first start, I would like to start by commenting a little bit on Gary's report. and before I continue. I agree largely with the narrative that is in the report, the argument that if they stay together, the DG and the minister, and they are competent to do their roles and jobs, then there is certainty and there's service delivery. I largely agree with that narrative. But I haggle a little bit with his methodology in terms of the figures he gives. I would like at least to give from our side that the situation is improving in the sense that, unlike it was taken 2009 to 2017, our own analysis, which is done by the Department of Public Service and Administration, starts from 2014 to 2019, which is a period of 5 years of the medium-term expenditure framework. We also cover a larger sample than Gary does. It does over 38 departments in the national department. We cover 159 departments, 44 national departments, and 115 provincial departments. And therefore, you would find that our statistics will show you that in 2014, when this new administration take over, the Director General, both provincial and national, will stay a period of about 31 months, which is 2 years, 7 months. But to date, as we are standing, a Director General stays a period of about 3 years. And our target for this medium-term strategic framework is 4 years. And we are in 2017 now, 3 years, and we hope to get 4 years by 2019. But we don't think we might meet that.
It is not only Gareth who says that, because I picked up another report somewhere, I don't know whether it was written by him or one of the sister newspapers in his department, that says between 2009 and 2014, a total of 177 permanent and acting directors general ran government departments. Of these, 28 directors general did not complete their full terms.
You see that again. You see, I don't want to undermine the fact that we agree with the narrative that they should stay longer, and in fact, it is the Public Service Commission that recommended that they should move from 3 years earlier to 5 years in order to deal with this question of certainty, in order to deal with corporate memory, and in order to ensure that service delivery, because you can't do anything in 2 years or 3 years in a department. But also, it's quite a complex relationship that has to be managed. Like in that period, some teachers would leave because, of course, it's a 5-year contract, which is possibly renewable or not renewable. And again, in Gary's...
But they don't finish the 5 years. Majority of them don't finish the 5 years.
Yes, but part of the reason that they don't finish the 5 years, I'm just saying it's not simplistic. It's not because only ministers do. Some of them, there are audit queries that are found, and they have to be disciplined in terms of the law. And therefore, they are found that they were guilty, and they are removed. All I'm just saying, in some instances, of course, they quarrel with their ministers, and sometimes the ministers themselves have been wrong in the way they deal with those matters, and they have to go. So I'm just saying it's a complex way that is not easy. Sometimes Parliament itself, when it does oversight, it says, why are you still keeping this incompetent DG in office? So there are quite a variety of things. It's a complex, this administrative relationship.
We'll come to some of those issues. Gareth, you also point out, and rightly so, and I quote, in any national government department, leadership resides in two parallel authorities. The minister is a political head of the ministry, of given ministry, responsible for policy, direction, oversight, and communication. The Director General, the administrative head of the department, responsible for the implementation of a policy program, procurement, the performance of staff, and the financial management of the department as prescribed by the PFMA. Is this not very clear that there are fault lines? There are fault lines here.
Fault lines between the minister and the Director
Between
General.
the minister and the Director in the way public service is run in this country. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, the way in which the job is conceived is politicians are essentially there to deliver a mandate they've got from voters. And that is to determine the program of action for a department.
Maybe you say that because I had a quarrel that somebody was telling me ministers are not public servants. And now you say that they have a mandate from the voters, so therefore ministers are also public servants.
Yeah. Yes, no, they are. Well, they're commonly referred to as public representatives, but both them and members of the public service serve the public and get public salaries. So essentially the political job of a minister is to provide a mandate, a program of action and a series of policies. Those need to be implemented by someone and actually run, which requires running systems, budgeting, buying whatever procurement or tenders you need in order to make something happen, and generally making sure the administration implements that policy, and that's the job of the Director General. So there shouldn't actually be a fault line. Those two should work in unison together. They should be on the same page. Both should understand what the policy program is they're trying to implement. The one might be constrained by budgetary constraints or the nature of the administration and the amount of skills, and that could be a source of frustration. Similarly, the Director General could be constrained by those same things and not be able to implement the policy. So there can be some friction, but ultimately they both have the same goal and they should be able to work towards that.
Yeah. Can I come in?
No, come in.
I think I really need to say that this is the crux of the problem, that the one that you have raised, Mr. Mateza, in the public sector. We have two pieces of legislation, the Public Service Act and the PFMA. Because of our historical past, in 1994, human resource management and organizational structures and everything were given to ministers, and powers to appoint staff and everything to ministers. And then the PFMA, when it came in 1999, gave all the management of resources and economic use of resources to a Director General. This creates a lot of tension because now the DG says, I need to appoint these people, and the minister can appoint these. Ministers sometimes don't delegate to DGs, although the law requires that they may delegate some of the functions. In fact, the recommendations of the Public Service Commission, together with the recommendations of the NDP, of the Planning Commission, say now that after 23 years, we should take all the human resources management, especially relating to chief directors downwards, and give them to the HOD, so that we keep again the financial management responsibility of the PFMA to that, and see that these people manage their role in a much more professional way than in this personal relationship that they do. But as long as those are divided as they are, we are still going to get this conflict where the DG say the minister is interfering in my administration, is appointing people who are incompetent, and secondly is telling me which tender to give. So we do need to deal with that problem.
It is very issue. Clear. My apologies, Advocate Sizani. Gary, if you can join in here. It is very clear, this in a company, if this was a company, South Africa Inc., and the minister plays the role of chairman,
yes,
and the Director General plays the role of the Chief Executive.
Yes.
Therefore, there should be no problem there in terms of governance. That is where governance go wrong.
Exactly, because our system has not reached the maturity that other systems relate, where we can differ, but we respect each other's roles. We respect the office, even if we differ with the person. Our system is quite, as Gary quite says in his paper, around personalities and personal relationships and personal trusts over those processes. We hope it will mature, but it's true what you are saying. It shouldn't be like that. These roles should interface and interact as long as you put the interests of the people up front. But there are questions of challenges of ethical leadership in our system of government.
I was saying to Gary before you came in that if I were to be a minister, I'm not a minister because I don't think I become a minister. If I were to be a minister, I will at least set a day aside or 2 days aside to sit down with my Director General. He must take me through the whole process, introduce me to each and every employee in the department. And that seems not to be happening.
Well, you're quite right. Actually, the problem of the personalized relationships that Gary talks about, when the minister and the DG are honky-dory, are friends, they meet every day, they travel together to meetings, performance contracts are done easily, staff is appointed by the DG and delegations, but once they quarrel, the DG doesn't get meetings, performance management is not done, the minister avoids the DG and calls junior officials to work with. And really, you are right, there should be those arrangements. That is why we've agreed with the NDP recommendations that the career incidents of DGs especially must be removed from ministers and must be given to what is called an administrative head of the public service, which decision, surprisingly, although approved by government in 2014, has not seen the light of day.
The other thing, Gary, what Advocate Cizon is saying around the relationship between the Minister and the Director General, what we sometimes do, if there's a cozy relationship between the Minister and the Director General, we say there's patronage here.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can say that from an outside perspective, but I mean, patronage has a very clear definition, which is, you know, there's natural patronage in any government system. The president appoints his cabinet, and those are people that he personally feels he can work with, and that's a kind of patronage, but it's perfectly legitimate. Illegitimate patronage is when you appoint someone for reasons other than their abilities or skills. And just because two people work closely together does not mean there's patronage necessarily, or some kind of corrupt version of that. It might just mean they get on well, which is actually what you want. So the problem comes when the system is perverted to achieve some end that is not legal or in the best interests of service delivery or the job description or mandates of a department or position.
You mentioned in your paper, well, I've given other figures, but you have figures that says 172 people have held positions of Directors General since 2009, either as in a permanent or acting capacity, which gives you an average of 20 months per department occupied by Directors General, serving in an acting capacity. The question, however, is, despite changes to the executive, why do this lead to administrative changes at Director General level? Why? Is it the patronage we're talking about? Is it the relationship that is not working between the Minister and the Director General?
Well, as I say, the variety of reasons, none of those reasons can be excluded. But one thing I wanted to haggle a little bit with Gary about is the fact that some of the changes in acting appointments are actually required by the law, because the person who's acting takes about 6 months to act, and then you can rotate or choose another person. He has, in his calculation, he has included both those elements. But the reality of the situation is that when a TG post has been absent in terms of the law or vacant, in terms of the law, you can fill it within 12 months. But usually the norm is 4 to 6 months. But in that period, then acting people start, and then DTGs are given opportunity to act and rotate among themselves, and you would find that those figures are there. But it does not take away from the fact that there's instability in those, and the fact that they are acting people, because acting people in departments are scared to take decisions. They are scared to implement long-term vision plans, and therefore service delivery does suffer. And we have always discouraged the issue of not filling the top posts in the public sector.
Yeah, can I just say something on that, which is that this thing of, first of all, on the reasons why Director Generals leave, and the Advocate's entirely correct. There are a wide range of reasons for these. Some of them are perfectly legitimate. A contract comes to an end. Some of them are perfectly legitimate in terms of mismanagement. In other words, you couldn't, in good conscience, keep a person on because they're not performing in you. But a lot of them, if you go through, and I've listed quite a lot of anecdotal examples, are the consequence of relationships breaking down, some kind of mismanagement or corruption or a political feud between whoever. So there are a wide variety of reasons, but the sum total of them all is a high turnover rate. On the point of acting Director Generals, the PMFA says no Director General position can ever be vacant. If someone is removed from that position, they must automatically, an acting Director General must be appointed. Now, ideally what you want is someone serves a 5-year term as a Director General, and within your department you earmark someone to take over for them if you're not going to extend their contract. And that person is groomed and matured into a senior position, a Chief Finance Officer or the Head of Human Resources, or a Deputy DG, with a view to offering that contract down the line. So the change, and they work closely with the existing DG, and when the contract's up, the next permanent accounting officer or Director General is appointed. But I find that in my research that a lot of these acting Director Generals are actually appointed as a consequence of some fallout that was unforeseen. A minister was fired or there was chaos. And so, as the Advocate rightly points out there, these people are not fully equipped to do the job. They haven't, it was forced on them unannounced, and they are nervous to make key decisions, mainly because they probably want to be appointed permanently, and so they're very hesitant about whether they don't have a contract yet. Should I make anyone angry? Should I do the right thing, not do the... So it lends itself to a kind of instability.
If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts about this program and many others you would like us to discuss to Rights Recourse at sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Africans are increasingly using digital platforms for life, work and play.
Information is key for us. We live in an information age. We live in the digital age.
I'm mostly on WhatsApp because not all my friends have iPhones, so they don't have FaceTime.
On Network, we tell you about Africa's technology and social media landscape.
And some here are using the internet to raise political concerns.
Some of the exposés on political issues come from what we call your diasporic online media.
Africans are also using technology to create. For African technology and social media news, join Ms. Phumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 9 p.m.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the Public Service Commission and the Public Service in South Africa. The other issue that concerns me, the African Peer Review Mechanism and its country report highlighted the Batubili principles as best practice, but is still, they say so in the report, it is still very poorly understood and has not addressed the fundamental issues of service delivery. Public participation is ad hoc with little information of public awareness, whose role is to make sure that departments adhere, whose role is it to make sure that departments adhere to these principles?
Those roles are given to us and largely to the Department of Public Service and Administration. The Department of Public Service and Administration set the norms and standards of observing those principles, both the Section 195 principles of responsiveness and so on, that in the Constitution, and subsumed, of course, within that is also these principles of putting people first, accountability, redress, and so on. And the Public Service Administration is supposed to put them, and departments are supposed also to promote them and practice them in their departments. One of the things that I must say, Mr. Mateza, is a very important question, is that apart from the issue of corruption, one of the major problems with our present public service is that they don't have service ethos. They don't have the values that are in the Constitution, founding values like the rule of law and observing the law, and the ones in 197 requiring them to actually implement only loyally the lawful policies of the government of the day. None of the public servants are instructed to obey instructions that are illegal from ministers. So there is the new Public Administration Act is supposed now to be promoting and setting up those norms to ensure that these values and principles are actually promoted and inculcated in our public service. But as of now, that is not happening well. And one of the problems that we have with the current public service is the lack of values, especially the issue of ethical leadership.
Gary, that brings us to another question, and that has all to do with something I read somewhere that says Directors General, or probably let's say the public service, is not insulated against political interference. And that brings me to a question of cadre deployment. How difficult is getting, as the NDP says, a public service that is professional if we are going to have cadre deployment? Cadre deployment, when we deploy somebody who knows what he's doing, is good, but sometimes can be flawed.
Right. Well, I mean, that's actually a far more complex question than... I mean, you need to set a few things out. The first thing is that any political party deploys people to key positions. It's part of being in charge. And there are positions in the public service, political positions, things like speechwriters, people that work inside a ministry that are out-and-out political appointments. The politician makes them. But essentially, there's supposed to be a bulwark between the politician and the public service. And those appointments are left to the public service largely to deal with. Now, what the ANC has done historically is to bypass that by effectively setting up cadre deployment committees in which it has people that on those committees don't differentiate between the public. This is historically, I think the system has fallen apart under Jacob Zuma, but at least under President Mbeki it worked quite efficiently like this, where the names would be vetted essentially for a whole lot of positions that were in the public service by the party. And it bypassed the whole of the public service and the Public Service Commission and any way in which the state could act against this, because the candidate that would appear would have been previously vetted, and so that was the party's choice effectively, and it was very difficult to act against.
Yes, but
yes, if I can join slightly a different angle on it, but on the same issue. The appointment on policy consideration, which are political considerations in our public service, are allowed by Section 195(2) of the of the Constitution. It allows that certain layers. But in the recommendations that we have made as a Public Service Commission, and also in the recommendations that are made by the NDP, is the 2 layers of Directors General and Deputy Director General, that they can be appointed with policy consideration because they work closely with ministers, and there's really a bit of overlap in administration and all policy making in our system. But what we've insisted, which is what the cadre deployment has failed in certain instances, is that if you are going to deploy those cadres that are close to you, they must please be competent. They must have the prerequisite qualification and competence that are required to carry out those jobs. That's where in certain instances it has failed. But I agree on the whole that, and which we recommend, that really from Chief Director, which is about level 14 downwards, that should be pure professional and meritorious appointment, taking into, of course, the issue of demographics within our public service. And that is not happening very well.
I'm tempted to say, Gary, help me if I'm wrong here, and that is we have a situation where there's this problem where people cannot, especially in government, many of your civil servants, I'm not saying it's caused by cadre deployment, but many of your public service cannot differentiate. You don't see the difference between the party and the state. Is that what is caused by cadre deployment?
Well, it was, especially actually from 1994 towards the current, say 2010. You could say that largely that was because when the government took over, largely there was the little minority apartheid officials who were dominant. So you had to mix them in order to create transformation. And therefore, you would find that a lot of political appointees came in, even in the public sector. And there was that question then of loyalty. Even when you talk to a public servant, you say to him, take the minister to court at that time because of this challenge. He says, I can't take my party or my comrade to court, and so on. But you can see now, there's an improvement now with the strength of the courts, with the strength of civil society, with also the issues of corruption and attack. DGs now are taking ministers to court, like in the Apleni case and so on. So we're beginning to see some improvement now, which is leading to much more
taking ministers to court only if it affects them. It affects their relationships, it affects their personal...
Yeah, which is really what upsets me with our DGs, and I've said that openly. They can complain to the public protector, they can be whistleblowers, they can come to the Public Service Commission. There are many things they can do, but they don't come and complain when the relations were still good. But when they are now sacked, they say, but I was being forced to sign this contract and so on. So I agree fully with you. Sometimes they invite these things upon themselves.
Gary, the other thing, about a month or so, I had members of the Afrikaner Broederbond here, and we were painting the same kind of pictures around how the National Party was functioning, or everybody who held a position within the National Party setup was vetted by the Afrikaner Broederbond. Isn't that the same thing?
Well,
I'm not comparing the Afrikaner Broederbond to democratic
not at all.
organizations.
Yes, well, look, my personal political analysis is that this is a way Nationalistic Parties Act, and it's something that the National Party and the African National Congress have in common, is a desire to control all aspects of the state. And if it can't, that control can't be achieved formally, then it's done informally through other structures and policies. And the ANC has been very explicit. At 1997 in Mafeking, they set out their cadre deployment policy for the first time, and it called for direct control over institutions that should be independent from political control, like the SABC. Even the judiciary, it explicitly says, we must control those levers of power, and it's why we must have our people deployed there. And the extent to which these kind of independent institutions have been compromised by politics, whether it's cadre deployment or patronage or factionalism, a whole lot of interest, is profound. I mean, almost all of the major state-owned entities are now run by acting COOs or COO, for the very reason that these positions are so contested. They're in charge of so much money and patronage that the ruling party is going to war and falling apart over all of them. So this problem of turmoil extends far beyond just director generals and ministers into a lot of other aspects of the state.
Mr. Siswadi, first of all, before you answer, yes,
can I follow up on Kerry?
Before you, I just want to find out something, whether people who work for the SABC and all state-owned enterprises, are they also part of the public service?
No, they're part of public administration, but not the public service, which is a good thing for me. But I just wanted to bring a different angle to what Gary is saying. He says nationalistic organizations have that thing of dominance over society. I don't know what he means by nationalistic organizations, but I can say even socialist and communist organizations have the term of hegemony over all levers of power in the state. So the African National Congress is quite right, if it won election, to actually seek to have influence in levers of the state. There is a narrative that actually...
Well, we've seen the DA doing the same thing in the municipalities.
So that's why I'm saying that one of the things that I don't agree with, which seems to be now taking root in our society, is that if you're a member of the African National Congress, you can't be independent, you can't be professional. I think that is not correct. It should be corrected. The issue here is that you should not use your membership to exclude other people who come from other parties. You should also not use your membership to serve the interests of your party. You should serve the interests of the people of South Africa, and therefore put the interests of the country over those of your party. And that is why I agree, in some instances, they have actually not got it right.
I don't know whether I've asked these questions, because I spoke about it before we came on air, and that is the question of institutional memory. You have a system at the SABC. You have a system where, at a certain age, the system kicks you out. So you must go on retirement, and nobody does an exit interview. As a result, we seem to be losing a great deal of institutional memory. Is it the same in government departments? It looks like it's the same.
Yes, well, one of the aspects of the report I did, which I think is unique to that report, is it didn't just track the number of cabinet changes and the number of director general changes, but it tried to work out exactly how long the average minister and director general worked together. And if we take a worst case scenario like the Department of Communications, which has just recently had its minister shuffled again, it's the seventh minister since 2009. But it's also had 8 or 9 DGs. And so the consequence of that is, since 2009, over an 8-year period, there have been 15 different relationships between ministers and director generals, of which almost half involve an acting director general, so not even a permanent employee. And the average time that a relationship lasts is it's about 7 months. Now that is a nightmare situation. That's admittedly a worst case scenario. There's some very well run departments that have had 1 or 2 ministers and 1 or 2 GGs over a long period, so they're not all like that. But it is typical of and the Department of Communications, as you alluded to earlier when we were talking privately about digital migration, is having a massive problem with this policy, and one of the reasons is because it's so held up by these kind of constraints.
A policy, for instance, this digital migration, in my view, that could create a whole lot of jobs, open up new avenues for youth, and I don't understand, why are we sitting and not rolling out this thing?
Well, it is part of the challenges that have been said that that department has, and of course also the break of that department now to communications and telecommunications. So, and also
which was a real pity.
And then the turnover of ministers and DGs. Let me just make this comment because I would like to make it that although I would not make any comments on the right of the president to change his executives, it's not part of the Public Service Commission's comment, but the ripple effects I would agree with that sometimes it does create instability, does delay programs that those changes, either DG or minister, to happen. But I must also say the opposite, that in some departments, both the DG and probably the current minister have messed up so much that a welcome change does improve and stabilize relationship in a department. And the third point that I would like to make is that in these changes, although I agree with Gary that the longer they are together, the more they achieve, it is true that some of those relationships do actually create patronage and corruption and need to be broken up. And the last point that I would like to make on this matter, which is important, not all the new ministers, of course, people comment about it, are actually new to the departments. You find that a minister who is sent back to the department was actually a minister previously, like Lindwe Sulu in Human Settlements. You would find actually some of the ministers are drawn from being chairpersons of portfolio committees overseeing those departments, and others were actually deputy ministers in those departments. So they do come in probably knowing the bureaucracy, and some continue to happen. And some of the bad things that were happening in the previous are dealt with. But I accept the principle that is making. The more they work together, the more they are competent together, and the more certainty is there, the more we achieve on service delivery.
Well, if you'd like to join us in today's discussion once again, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rise Recourse, or alternatively, you can email your thoughts to writeandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Here we are witnessing the beginning of the end of the apartheid system.
If you did a paternity test on our constitution, whose DNA would come up? Not Nelson Mandela, not F.W. de Klerk, Oliver Tambo.
Welcome back as we continue our discussion on the Public Service Administration Department and also the Public Service Commission. Advocate Sizani, according to the National Development Plan, as part of its 2030 vision, South Africa needs to focus relentlessly on building a professional public service and a capable state. At this rate, are we going to meet these objectives?
Well, I don't think so. If you look at the type of public service that we have, because in order to reach a professional public service, first and foremost, departments, which all of them have not really done, is to ensure that we have people who have the technical skills, apart from the generic skills, to carry out. Most of the adverts of the departments, if you see them, they want a general BA degree. So you would find a public servant who, for instance, has biblical studies.
At least they place an M before the BA, MBA.
and then you'll find a public servant who has biblical studies heading a department of transport. But if you go to a country like China and so on, they would require a civil engineer to be the head of that. So we still need to build the capacity to deal with that. The second point that I would want to make, which is still worrying us, is the fact that the fact that the university education that prepares the kids from the public service is not geared to ensuring that it produces a model public servant that can deliver on the demands of the government of the day. And that really creates the problems in the sense that if you get a lawyer, for instance, which is an area that I know, does not mean when that lawyer is there is going to litigate cases, know the law. That's why government loses 7 out of 10 cases that it goes to court about. And the last point that I would like to worry, for that public service that is going to serve a developmental state, it needs to be also value-based. And the values are going backwards. Until we build up an ethical, professional public service, we are not going to meet the 2030 goals.
Well, let's take this call from Cape Town. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mateza.
Good afternoon.
My question, Mr. Mateza, is how true is it, or is it still possible in this modern day and age in Africa really to get leaders who have got interest of the people at heart when we have got all this money and this wealth and this capitalist state where whoever has got the money controls the resources? So I think we will struggle really to get people who have got the interest of the people at heart. And you see some of this relationship, I was so concerned when one day you see Pravin Daddy say, the president has got the right to appoint and disappoint, but only when they are fired, these people, that's when they started to open up and say, this president is not good, he was so bad, but he was in the cabinet, they don't resign. But for them not to resign, I feel it's money which is making them not to resign. You will see, again, SABC will do the same, I think, very soon. You are serving with the behest of the president, but you will see from now on, you will be the greatest enemy of the president and speak bad about the president. So I'm not sure if we are going to get leaders who have got interest of the people at heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Kennedy. Thank you, Kennedy. I didn't pick up many of the things Kennedy said, but I can hear he's referring, he's harking back to something we spoke about earlier, where the Director Generals will only stand up to the minister if their own security is at stake.
Exactly.
He's making the same statement regarding the ministers.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we have said to Directors General, at least from my chair where I sit, that the Nuremberg defense of the Hitler generals, that they were following orders, doesn't apply in our constitutional state. They need to be responsive and accountable, and they need to ensure that the effective use of resources of the state are used in the interest of the people, and that they need to be ethical and be courageous in standing for those things. So these are some of the values that they don't have. And therefore, I share the sentiments of the caller that it's important that, especially our Directors General, that if they see something wrong, they must stand up to it and they must refuse to carry unlawful instructions.
Gary, public servants need to let the Constitution, particularly, I think the advocate mentioned this before, Section 237 of the Constitution, which stipulates that is 197 or 237, that stipulates that all constitutional obligations must be performed diligently without delay
239.
To guide their decisions and actions. Citizens want a state that cares, listens, and that is ethical. Are we getting that?
Well, look, this whole thing about the Batupile principles is an interesting one because those principles are essentially designed to engender in the public service a compassionate, caring spirit. It's not so much, those are not about what must or mustn't be delivered, it's about the manner in which the public service engages with the public. Now, values are very hard to inculcate into a person. The private sector often, when it does a performance or management appraisal of someone, will not only measure their outcomes. So did you deliver these 5 things we agreed upon, but did you also live up to our values? Were you friendly? Did you answer the phone on time? Did you arrive on time? You know, did you care about the institution that you work in and take pride in it? I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on this, to what degree the public service does monitor the Butterpillar principles when it comes to performance management. But it might be something to look at. If you want people to actually take these principles on board and embody them when they talk to people, you need to actually hold them to account against those principles. And I'm not sure to what degree that's being done, or if it's being done effectively.
To what extent let's take your corruption call center, or whatever you call it. To what extent has it been successful?
Well, let me agree with you. You were right. That's actually section 237.
237, yes.
Yes, you were right. And let me just say that the call center has a problem in the sense that the people remain anonymous, so you can't give them feedback. And the referrals that we send to departments, departments don't give feedback on time, even if when we give them 40 days to deal with it. So, but our call center, the public service call center, is much more successful in dealing with it. But it has problems. Many of the callers are anonymous, and to deal with that. The one thing that I also wanted to add on what Gary was saying is that one of the things that our public service and some Harvard professors wrote about this, that if you can measure it, you can do it. And we have asked the public service, since 2013, there was an agreement with unions on productivity and also service standards. Most of the departments to date, including the Department of Health, still have not set up service standards in line with the service charter of 2013. And
that is why we bump into things like life as a demand.
Its demand is clearly a failure of setting service standards, a failure of applying Butterpillar principles, and much more importantly, it was not their finest hour, those public sector workers.
Gareth, our transformation, the transformation of state is a state and society, has been a project that has been around for many years now, 22, 23 years. How have we fared? We have heard from several leaders in government. We have been given an idea of the achievement and challenges in our quest to realize the state envisages the constitution, but how far are we from reaching? I was saying earlier, for instance, to somebody, the National Development Plan 2030 will have to be extended because 2030 is ending in another 10 years.
Well, look, you have to, once again, that question's more complicated than it seems. You have to define your terms. First of all, what it is that you mean by transformation. For a lot of people, transformation is a euphemism for demographic representativity. In other words, you want a public service that broadly reflects the demographics of the country and people feel represents them and their interests. If transformation is a more ideological concern, in other words, you want a certain way of behaving, then you need to define that, and I'm not sure it is. But as far as demographic representativity goes, the national administration, and I stand to be corrected, national government departments, has been broadly demographically representative for almost a decade now. And so I don't think transformation in that sense is a problem in the national administration at all. I mean, the private sector is a different story, and if you go out from the national administration towards the provinces and local, maybe it's a different story. But certainly as far as national government goes, it seems to be a demographically representative and has been for a long period of time.
Advocate Sisadi, you have a new service charter that sets out norms and standards for public servants. Is it compulsory? Is somebody adhering to it?
They are not, and that's why we hope that the Public Administration and Management Act, when it comes into force, it will make it compulsory to deal with that, because this now is an agreement between government and unions, and the officials in departments are not implementing it, and it's worrying us. And I agree with Gary, on the points
on transformation.
On transformation, that we have addressed the race issue.
The other thing
it's
for
only
me,
disability that is a challenge.
The other thing for me really is everybody seems to think that they have to work for the state. The state has become too big an employer. And we have that is probably why we have not passed the industrial policy.
Well, look, the size of the public service, in my opinion, is out of control. It's growing almost year on year, and the reason why it is such a big problem is the public wage bill, In other words, the cost of salaries...
61 billion rand.
It's a staggering amount, and there's a new wage agreement going to be negotiated now between unions and the Public Service and Administration Department, and it's likely to be above inflation again. And the problem is that the wage bill is growing faster than inflation is, and that puts, as a percentage of your whole GDP, ours is starting to reach the point where it's at a crisis level. And that affects your ability to use the budget for other deliverables when you're paying enormous amounts for salaries. And what the finance minister revealed in his latest budget is that those salaries in the public sector per wage level, if you go along them, the public sector servants are actually getting paid more than the average person in the private sector, except for the top levels. In almost every low level, public sector wages outstrip the private sector. And it's a problem that's out of control, I think.
And there's no productivity, as you said earlier.
Exactly.
The other question I want to know, with the time we have very little time, is I was a little bit intrigued by your reporting lines, that you work with public service, but you report to a different minister from the Minister of Public Administration, Public Service Administration, you report to the minister in the presidency, isn't it?
Not ourselves. Ourselves as a commission, we report directly to Parliament. We don't
report to Parliament.
When we don't report to any minister, including the President.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't pick that up, but my apologies for that. And surely then we do have a problem, Mr. Sizani, with public service, especially what is reported out by Gary, 172 Directors General, either permanent or acting, have been changed since 2009. What do we do with that? I know you have a much bigger figure. You're looking at 2000. You're looking at 2019. Are you saying we're going to lose directors generals in 2019?
No, I do admit with the narrative that Kerry says that if we don't have settlement and stability at the top echelons of our public service, and if we don't treat them well with dignity, and we allow ministers to run roughshod over them, it is a problem, because service delivery does suffer. It's a matter that we have raised with the Minister of Public Service and Administration. It's a matter that as a Public Service Commission we have even raised to the Presidency, that we are very happy and welcome the case, for instance, of our planning, which says that now the power to suspend and discipline DGs still reverts to the Presidency. We don't know if he will delegate that now. But in the light of some of the problems we have seen and some of the overreaches that ministers have done in dealing with DGs, we feel it's not in the interest of service delivery to actually delegate that function.
Well, I think we are, Gary, a far cry from what President Mandela said. We are confident that, motivated by the desire to serve the people, the public service will discharge its responsibility with diligence, sensitivity, and enthusiasm. Among other things, paying attention to the important goal of increasing efficiency and productivity. Listening to the discussion between us here, it would seem we are far from reaching what President Mandela wanted us to reach.
I agree fully.
Yes, well, I think on all the fronts, there are fundamental problems. I mean, there's a skills deficit problem and an excellence and merit problem in the public service. There is a wage problem. There is an attitude problem. People just do not experience the public service as a compassionate and friendly institution that's there to help you on a wide variety of fronts. And there is a political problem, as evidenced by the kind of turnover that you get. And it is true that some of that is legitimate turnover that happens in any administration, but a large part of that is not, and is the consequence of politics and the public service merging in an unhealthy way.
Advocate Sizani, talking about skills, Gary has raised, I thought there was a school of governance similar to the Kennedy schools of governance in the United States of America. Do we have something like that?
We have a school of government that is aspiring to reach those heights, but it has not yet reached those heights. It's led by Professor Levin, and is trying to do that, to bridge the skill gaps between what students are taught at university and what are the requirements and the strategic goals of the public sector as it delivers to the people. But we are still struggling to set it up, and we are still struggling even with the funding model. And now with the cuts and the growth that is not there, it's difficult to see how we're going to fund to ensure that those programs actually achieve. But it is there, and it is promising in terms of what it's trying to do.
Are universities not helping you? I think Wits was helping.
Yeah, the universities are helping, but we have not yet been on the same wavelength with them in terms of what are the requirements of government that are dealing with. But these schools of public management, VETS, techies, and also Stellenbosch and others are working with, and Western Cape, they are working with us to try and develop a curricula that will ensure, we hope that an induction program will be created, for instance, for about 3 months, which will allow that a person who's employed newly in the public service will go to the School of Government and get inducted, so that by the time they reach departments, they know how to write a memorandum, how to do a submission, how to do a budget, and so on.
You'll notice that we did not talk about municipalities, provincial departments, and other organizations. We only concentrated on the national departments. And if you looking in the words of the National Planning Commission, and I quote, "If we are to develop and maintain a professional, people and service-oriented public service, we need to ensure that the public service becomes a calling of excellence and a career which should be sought after, and not for its financial gains and security, but because it is the haven for passionate patriots who want to serve South Africans." This has been Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning. From all of us in the studio, thank you to our guests and goodbye.